When I discovered what really happened to my sister Carrie that summer night in 1982, my first reaction wasn't shock or disbelief. It was relief. After 43 years of carrying the weight of partial truths, half-formed suspicions, and the gnawing certainty that something was terribly wrong with the official story, having the complete picture finally made sense of the nightmare that had haunted every single day of my life since I was 24 years old. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, though everyone calls me Ellie, and I'm 67 years old now. For more than 4 decades, I've kept a secret that has eaten away at me like acid on metal, slowly corroding every relationship, every moment of happiness, every attempt at normal life. I've watched my parents go to their graves believing a lie. I've raised my own daughters in the shadow of a family tragedy that was never what it seemed. I've attended memorial services, placed flowers on a grave, and nodded solemnly when people spoke of accidents and fate and God's mysterious ways. But there was nothing mysterious about what happened to Caroline Ann Hartwell on July 23, 1982. There was nothing accidental about the way my 19-year-old sister ended up at the bottom of Miller's Quarry with water in her lungs and a blood alcohol level that suggested she'd been drunk enough to stumble and fall. And there was certainly nothing ordained by God about the careful orchestration of events that led to her death being ruled a tragic accident rather than what it truly was. I know this because I was there. Not at the quarry itself, but close enough to see things I wasn't supposed to see. Close enough to hear things that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my town, and the people I'd trusted my entire life. And for 43 years I've kept my mouth shut because the truth was too dangerous, too complicated, and too devastating to speak aloud. But I'm 67 years old now, and the people I was protecting are either dead or beyond the reach of consequences that matter anymore. My daughters are grown with families of their own. My husband, James, passed away 7 years ago, and with him went the last person who knew bits and pieces of what I carried. I have nothing left to lose, and everything to gain by finally telling the truth about what happened to Carrie. Before I go any further, I need to say something important. This story, my story, is real. Every word of it happened exactly as I'm going to tell you. And if you've ever felt like you're drowning in a secret, if you've ever carried knowledge that feels too heavy to bear, then maybe you'll understand why it's taken me this long to speak. But I'm speaking now, and I need you to hear every word, because the truth about Carrie deserves to be known, even if it comes 43 years too late. If you're watching this, if you're listening to my story, I want to ask you for something before we go any further. This channel shares real stories from real people like me. Stories that don't always make it into the newspapers or onto the evening news. Stories about ordinary women facing extraordinary situations and finding the strength to survive them. It's completely free for you to watch, but it helps us reach more people when you take just 1 second to click that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future stories. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what you think as this story unfolds, and let me know what city or country you're watching from. Your support, your likes, your comments, they all help this channel grow and reach other women who need to hear stories like mine. It means more than you know, and I'm grateful you're here. Now let me tell you about Carrie, and about the summer that destroyed my family. Cedar Falls, Iowa, in 1982, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Or at least, they thought they did. It was a town of about 35,000 people, nestled along the Cedar River, with tree-lined streets and brick storefronts, downtown and neighborhoods where the houses all had front porches, and the families inside them had lived there for generations. My family, the Hartwells, had been in Cedar Falls since my great-grandfather moved there in 1923 to work at the John Deere tractor factory. I was born Eleanor Margaret Hartwell in September of 1958, the first child of Richard and Dorothy Hartwell. My father worked as a supervisor at the Rath Packing Company, one of the big employers in the area back then, before it went under in the 80s. My mother was a secretary at Lincoln Elementary School, a job she'd held since before I was born, and would keep until she retired in 1995. We lived in a modest 2-story house on Sycamore Street, yellow with white trim, with a vegetable garden out back that my mother tended religiously, and a garage where my father kept his tools, organized with the precision of a man who believed that everything had its proper place. Carrie came along 5 years after me, in March of 1963. I still remember the day my parents brought her home from the hospital, this tiny bundle wrapped in a pink blanket with the most serious expression on her face, like she was already judging the world and finding it wanting. From the very beginning, Carrie and I were different in almost every way. I was quiet, studious, the kind of child who sat in the corner reading library books, while the other kids played kickball at recess. Carrie was all fire and energy, always moving, always questioning, always pushing against the boundaries our parents tried to set. Growing up, our family fit neatly into the working-class fabric of Cedar Falls. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. There was always enough food on the table, always clothes that fit well enough even if they weren't the latest fashion, always a sense that we were one major emergency away from financial disaster. My father brought home his paycheck every 2 weeks, and my mother deposited it at the Hawkeye Savings Bank downtown, and they carefully managed every dollar to make sure the mortgage got paid. The utilities stayed on, and there was a little bit left over for the church collection plate on Sundays. Our neighborhood was full of families just like ours. The Johnsons next door had 4 kids, and Mr. Johnson worked at the same plant as my father. The Andersons across the street ran a small hardware store downtown. The Petersons 2 houses down had a beauty salon in their finished basement, where Mrs. Peterson gave perms to the neighborhood ladies every Saturday. Everyone looked out for everyone else's kids. Everyone knew who belonged where. And everyone maintained the unspoken agreement that we'd all keep up appearances and follow the rules that kept our little corner of Iowa orderly and predictable. This was the world Carrie and I grew up in during the 1960s and 1970s. I graduated from Cedar Falls High School in 1976 and started classes at the University of Northern Iowa that fall, commuting from home because we couldn't afford for me to live in the dorms. I was studying to be a teacher, following in my mother's footsteps into a respectable, stable profession. I met my future husband James in a psychology class my sophomore year. He was studying business administration, planning to take over his father's insurance agency someday. We started dating in early 1978, got engaged in the spring of 1980, and married that August in a small ceremony at St. Patrick's Catholic Church, the same church where Carrie and I had been baptized. By the summer of 1982, James and I had been married for 2 years. We lived in a small apartment on the east side of town, and I was teaching 4th grade at Orange Elementary, while James worked at Hartwell Insurance. His father had added James's name to the business when we got married. We were building a life together, slow and steady, the way you were supposed to do it. We'd started talking about buying a house, maybe starting a family in a few years once we'd saved up enough money. Carrie, meanwhile, was 19 and had just finished her freshman year at the University of Northern Iowa. Unlike me, she'd fought hard to live in the dorms, and our parents had reluctantly agreed, though it stretched their budget to the breaking point. Carrie was studying journalism, much to our father's dismay. He'd hoped she'd choose something more practical, like nursing or teaching. But Carrie had always been determined to write, to tell stories, to uncover truths that people wanted to keep hidden. She wrote for the student newspaper and was always talking about becoming an investigative journalist, about going to Chicago or New York and working for a major paper. That summer, Carrie had come home to Cedar Falls for the break. She'd gotten a job waitressing at Montague's, a family restaurant downtown on Main Street. It was the kind of place where the lunch special was always meatloaf or fried chicken, where the coffee was terrible, but everyone drank it anyway, and where the same people sat in the same booths at the same times every single day. My mother thought it was good for Carrie to have a summer job, to learn the value of hard work and earn some spending money for the upcoming school year. But I could tell something had changed in Carrie during her freshman year away. She'd always been spirited and independent, but there was a new edge to her now, a kind of restless energy that made me nervous. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable. She challenged things that had always just been accepted as the way things were. She'd come home for dinner at our parents' house and end up in arguments with our father about politics, about religion, about the way things were done in Cedar Falls. I remember one Sunday dinner in early June, just a few weeks into summer break. We were all sitting around the dining room table, me and James, Carrie, our parents, eating pot roast and boiled potatoes. Carrie had been quiet through most of the meal, which should have been a warning sign because Carrie was never quiet. Then, out of nowhere, she looked at our father and asked, "Dad, why do you think Sheriff Morrison never investigated what happened to Jenny Callahan?" The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Jenny Callahan had been a girl in Carrie's grade who died in a car accident 3 years earlier, in 1979. She'd supposedly been driving drunk and crashed into a tree on Highway 58, just outside of town. Her death had been ruled an accident, and that was that. Our father set down his fork with deliberate care. "That was a tragedy," he said, his voice tight with warning. "A young girl making a stupid decision and paying the price for it. There's nothing to investigate." "But Jenny didn't drink," Carrie persisted. "Everyone knew that. She was practically president of the Students Against Drunk Driving Club. And her car went off the road right near the Morrison farm, where the sheriff's nephew Kevin was having a party that night. Don't you think that's a strange coincidence?" "Carrie," our mother said sharply, "that's enough. I'm just saying that maybe there's more to the story than enough." Our father's palm hit the table hard enough to make the plates rattle. "I won't have you spreading gossip and rumors at my table. Jenny Callahan's death was investigated by the proper authorities and ruled an accident. End of discussion." But Carrie didn't drop it. Not really. I could see her jaw tighten, could see her filing away our father's reaction for future reference. After dinner, when she and I were alone washing dishes in the kitchen, she turned to me with fierce intensity in her eyes and said, "Something's not right in this town, Ellie. There are things happening that people don't want to talk about. Important things." I'd laughed nervously, wanting to diffuse the tension. "Carrie, you're not in journalism school right now. This is Cedar Falls. Nothing exciting ever happens here." She'd looked at me like I'd disappointed her. "That's what they want you to think." I didn't understand then what she meant by they. I didn't understand a lot of things that summer. I was too busy with my own life, too focused on my marriage and my job and my plans for the future to pay close attention to my little sister's conspiracy theories and her conviction that there were dark secrets lurking beneath Cedar Falls' peaceful surface. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed. I can see how Carrie was pulling at threads that someone didn't want pulled. I can see how her questions were getting closer and closer to truths that powerful people had worked very hard to bury. But at the time, I just thought she was being dramatic, the way teenagers often are. I thought she'd outgrow it, settle down, realize that not everything needed to be questioned or challenged. I was so wrong. The person who would become central to what happened to Carrie was someone I'd known my entire life, someone who was woven into the fabric of Cedar Falls so deeply that questioning him seemed like questioning the town itself. Robert Morrison had been the sheriff of Black Hawk County for nearly 20 years. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a belly that had grown substantial over the years. He had a thick mustache and a way of speaking that made everything sound like simple common sense. People trusted Sheriff Morrison. When he said something was true, they believed him. Morrison came from one of the oldest families in the area. His grandfather had been a state senator. His father had owned Morrison Farm Equipment, one of the most successful businesses in the county. Robert himself had been a star football player at Cedar Falls High in the late 1950s, before going off to the University of Iowa, and then coming back home to join the sheriff's department. He'd worked his way up through the ranks and been elected sheriff in 1964, and had been re-elected every 4 years since, without serious opposition. He was married to Linda Morrison, who taught piano lessons and organized the annual church bazaar. They had 3 children, Robert Jr., who worked for his grandfather's old company, Margaret, who'd married a lawyer and moved to Des Moines, and Kevin, who, at 22 years old, in the summer of 1982, was widely known as a troublemaker, despite his family connections, or maybe because of them. I'm including all these details because they matter. Because understanding what happened to Carrie means understanding the power structures in Cedar Falls. Understanding who had influence and who didn't. Understanding how a town could collectively agree to believe a lie rather than face an uncomfortable truth. That summer started out ordinarily enough. I taught summer school 3 mornings a week. James worked his regular hours at the insurance agency. Carrie waitressed at Montague's and spent her evenings with her friends from high school. Our parents maintained their routines. Everything seemed normal, predictable, safe. But Carrie was digging. I didn't know it then, but she'd started asking questions at the restaurant, chatting up the regular customers, particularly the ones who'd had a few too many beers and were feeling talkative. She was gathering information, piecing together a picture of something that she believed was wrong, something that needed to be exposed. The first real sign that something was off came in early July. Carrie stopped by my apartment one evening after her shift at the restaurant. She seemed agitated, excited in a way that made me nervous. "Ellie, I need to tell someone about this," she said, pacing around my small living room while James watched the news on our old television set. "I've been hearing things about Sheriff Morrison and his son." I should have listened more carefully. I should have taken her seriously. Instead, I told her to be careful about making accusations, especially about someone like Robert Morrison. I told her that people didn't like troublemakers, that she could get herself into serious problems by spreading rumors. She'd looked at me with such disappointment. "I thought you'd understand," she said quietly. "I thought you'd want to know the truth." "The truth about what, exactly?" I'd asked, frustrated. "You haven't even told me what you think you know." "I'm still gathering evidence," she said. "But when I have everything I need, I'm going to write an article for the Northern Iowan. Maybe even send it to the Des Moines Register. People need to know what's really going on." That was the last real conversation I had with my sister. 3 weeks later, she was dead. The weeks between early July and July 23rd, 1982, played out like a slow-motion disaster that I couldn't see clearly until it was too late. Looking back now with the clarity that comes from 4 decades of regret and analysis, I can identify at least 8 distinct moments where I should have known something terrible was about to happen. 8 warning signs that I either dismissed or failed to recognize as the red flags they truly were. The first sign came on July 6th, about 2 weeks into the month. I was shopping for groceries at the Hy-Vee on the corner of University and Main when I ran into Sheriff Morrison in the produce section. He was examining tomatoes with the kind of concentration that seemed excessive for someone just buying vegetables for dinner. When he noticed me, his expression shifted in a way I couldn't quite read at the time. Something between recognition and calculation. "Eleanor Hartwell," he said, pronouncing my full name with deliberate emphasis, though everyone called me Ellie. "How are you doing? How's that husband of yours?" "We're fine, Sheriff," I replied, trying to edge past him toward the lettuce. There was something about the way he was looking at me that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't have explained why. It was just a grocery store conversation with a public official I'd known my entire life. "Good, good. And your sister Carrie? How's she enjoying her summer back home?" The question seemed innocuous enough, the kind of polite inquiry anyone might make in a small town. But there was something underneath it, a weight to the words that made my heart beat a little faster. "She's working at Montague's," I said. "Saving up for school." "Yes, I've seen her there," he said, still examining those tomatoes with theatrical care. "She's become quite the conversationalist, hasn't she? Always asking questions, wanting to know everyone's stories." He looked up at me then, and his eyes were cold despite his smile. "You know, Eleanor, there's an old saying about curiosity and cats. Might be worth sharing with your little sister." My hands tightened on my shopping cart. "I'm sure Carrie's just being friendly, Sheriff. She's studying journalism. She likes hearing people's stories." "Journalism?" he repeated like the word itself was distasteful. "Yes, well, some stories are better left alone. Not everything needs to be news. You understand what I'm saying, Eleanor?" I did understand. In that moment. I understood perfectly that Sheriff Morrison was warning me, using polite words and a friendly tone, to deliver a threat. I understood that somehow Carrie had gotten his attention in a way that made him feel the need to intimidate her through her older sister. And I understood that I was scared, standing there in the produce section of the Hy-Vee at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, scared of a man who was supposed to protect and serve our community. What I did with that understanding was exactly nothing. I muttered something about telling Carrie to focus on her waitressing job and her classes, grabbed a head of lettuce without even checking if it was fresh, and practically ran to the checkout line. When I got home, I didn't call Carrie. I didn't go to my parents. I didn't tell James about the strange encounter until later that evening. And even then I downplayed it, made it seem like nothing more than the sheriff being his usual overbearing self. That was the first time I failed my sister. But it wouldn't be the last. The second sign came 5 days later, on July 11th. I was having lunch at my parents' house on a Sunday after church, and Carrie showed up late, which wasn't unusual for her. But what was unusual was the bruise on her left arm, about halfway between her shoulder and elbow. It was the size and shape of a large handprint, the kind of mark that comes from someone gripping too hard, fingers digging in with force. "What happened to your arm?" my mother asked immediately, her maternal radar picking up on the injury, even before Carrie had fully sat down at the table. Carrie glanced at the bruise like she'd forgotten it was there. "Oh, that! Just bumped into a shelf at work. You know how narrow those aisles are in the kitchen at Montague's. But I'd worked food service during my college years, and I knew what injuries from restaurant work looked like. Burns from hot pans, cuts from knives, maybe the occasional bump from carrying too many plates. This wasn't that. This was someone's hand, clear as day, fingers and thumb distinct in the purple-yellow discoloration of her pale skin. I should have pulled her aside after lunch. I should have asked her privately what really happened, pushed past her obvious lie until she told me the truth. Instead, I accepted her explanation because accepting it was easier than confronting whatever reality lay beneath the surface. I told myself that maybe she had bumped into something, that maybe the mark just coincidentally looked like a handprint, that maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. My mother seemed satisfied with the explanation, or at least willing to pretend she was. My father didn't even seem to notice the bruise, too focused on complaining about some problem at the packing plant. And Carrie, she just sat there eating her pot roast like nothing was wrong, though I noticed she kept her bruised arm close to her body, turning it inward so the marks wouldn't be as visible. That night, lying in bed next to James, I mentioned the bruise. "Don't you think it's weird?" I asked in the darkness. "The shape of it." "Kids are always getting bumps and bruises," he mumbled, half asleep. "I'm sure it's nothing." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. The third sign happened on July 14th, and this one I couldn't explain away or rationalize, no matter how hard I tried. Carrie called me at school during my lunch break, which was odd because she knew I taught summer classes and was usually unreachable during the day. The school secretary came to my classroom and said I had an urgent call, and my first thought was that something had happened to our parents. But it was Carrie, and she sounded terrified. "Ellie, someone broke into my room at the dorm," she said, her words coming fast and breathless. "They went through everything. My notes, my research, my notebooks. Everything's been rearranged. Someone was looking for something." "Did you call campus security?" I asked, my teacher voice automatically taking over, trying to sound calm and practical. "No, Ellie, I can't report this. You don't understand. The things I've been looking into, the people involved. If I make an official report, it's going to make things worse." My stomach dropped. "Carrie, what exactly have you been looking into?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, could practically feel her trying to decide how much to tell me. "Remember Jenny Callahan? The girl who supposedly died in that drunk driving accident?" "Carrie." "She wasn't drunk, Ellie. She was at a party at Morrison Farm that night, Kevin Morrison's party. And something happened there. Something bad. And it's not just Jenny. There have been other incidents, other times when things got covered up because the sheriff's son was involved. I've been talking to people, gathering statements, building a case." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "Jesus, Carrie, you're investigating the sheriff's son. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" "That's exactly why I'm calling you. Someone knows what I'm doing. Someone broke into my room to see how much I know. I think..." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I think someone's been following me, Ellie. I keep seeing the same truck, dark blue Chevy, always a block or two behind me when I'm driving." Every protective instinct I had started screaming. "You need to stop this, Carrie. Right now. Whatever you think you know, it's not worth getting hurt over." But Jenny deserves justice. Her parents deserve to know the truth about what happened to their daughter. "And you deserve to be safe!" I practically shouted into the phone, not caring that the school secretary could probably hear me through the thin walls. "Carrie, please. If someone broke into your room, if someone's following you, you need to stop digging and let it go." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. "You know what, Ellie? I thought you'd understand. I thought you'd want to help. But you're just like everyone else in this town, willing to look the other way, as long as it doesn't affect you personally. That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time you questioned anything? When was the last time you stood up for what was right instead of what was comfortable?" She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in the school office, holding the receiver and listening to the dial tone, my hands shaking so hard I could barely replace the phone on its cradle. I should have gone to her immediately. I should have driven to the UNI campus, packed up her things, brought her home, made her feel safe. I should have gone to someone. The police. Though not Sheriff Morrison. The dean of students, a lawyer, anyone who might have been able to help protect her. Instead, I went back to my classroom and taught the afternoon session on long division. I went home and made dinner. I told James about the phone call, but framed it as Carrie being paranoid and dramatic, looking for intrigue where there probably wasn't any. I convinced myself that she was probably overreacting, that the dorm room break-in was likely just random campus theft, that the blue truck she kept seeing was coincidence or imagination. I was so good at lying to myself that summer. The fourth sign came on July 17th. I saw Carrie's car parked outside the Black Hawk County Courthouse, downtown at 7 in the evening. Which was odd, because the courthouse closed at 5. I was driving home from a dentist appointment, and I almost didn't stop. But something made me pull into the parking lot. Something made me get out and walk toward her car. Carrie was sitting in the driver's seat, staring up at the courthouse windows with an intensity that was almost frightening. She had a camera in her lap, one of those 35mm cameras she'd gotten for her journalism classes, and a notebook on the passenger seat, filled with her cramped handwriting. I knocked on her window and she jumped, actually jumped like I'd fired a gun. When she saw it was me, relief and annoyance crossed her face in equal measure. She rolled down the window. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "Working on a story," she said, her chin lifting in that defiant way it did when she knew she was doing something people wouldn't approve of. By staking out the courthouse after hours? I'm not staking out the courthouse. I'm documenting who comes and goes from certain offices. She pointed up at the 3rd floor. The sheriff's department has offices up there, administrative stuff, and I've noticed some interesting patterns in terms of who visits after normal business hours. Carrie, this is crazy. You're going to get yourself arrested for stalking or something. It's a public building. I have every right to be here. Even if that's technically true, you know how this looks, right? You know what people will say? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean they'll say I'm a troublemaker? That I should mind my own business? That I'm being disrespectful to a pillar of the community? She turned to look at me fully. I don't care what they say, Ellie. I care about the truth. The truth about what, exactly? What do you think you're going to find? She was quiet for a moment, debating. Then she opened her notebook and showed me a page filled with dates, names, and brief notes. Kevin Morrison has been involved in at least 4 incidents over the past 3 years that I can document. Jenny Callahan's death, a hit and run that got blamed on a migrant worker who conveniently left town before the investigation concluded, an assault at a bar that got swept under the rug, and a girl named Susan Perry, who dropped out of school last year and moved away suddenly, right after a party at Morrison Farm. My blood ran cold. How do you know all this? I talked to people. I found witnesses who were too scared to say anything officially, but were willing to talk to me off the record. I've been building a case, Ellie. A real case. And I think the sheriff has been covering up for his son, using his position to make problems disappear. And you're going to what? Publish this in the school newspaper. Carrie, they'll sue you for libel. The Morrisons will destroy you. Not if everything I write is true. Truth is a defense against libel. That's not how it works in the real world, I said, frustrated and frightened in equal measure. Even if you're right, even if everything you think happened actually happened, do you really think you're going to take down the sheriff of Black Hawk County? You're a 19-year-old college freshman with a camera and a notebook. He has power, connections, resources. This isn't going to end well for you. She looked at me with such sadness then. So I should just let him get away with it. Let Kevin Morrison keep hurting people because his father has a badge and knows the right people. I'm not saying that. I'm saying there are better ways to handle this. Talk to your professors, or a real journalist, or... I've tried. She actually shouted it, her voice echoing off the courthouse walls. I went to Professor Daniels in the journalism department. He told me to drop it. I called the Des Moines Register, and they wouldn't even take my call. Once I mentioned Sheriff Morrison's name. Don't you get it? Nobody wants this story. Nobody wants to believe that someone they've trusted for 20 years might be corrupt. We sat there in the parking lot as the sun set, casting long shadows across the courthouse square. I wanted to help her. God, I wanted to help her. But I was 24 years old, married to a man whose business depended on maintaining good relationships in the community, living in a town where going against someone like Robert Morrison could ruin your entire life. Please, Carrie, I finally said. Just be careful. Whatever you're doing, please be careful. She nodded, but I could see she'd already written me off as someone who wouldn't help her. I'm always careful, Ellie. That was the last time we had anything approaching a real conversation. The fifth sign came 2 days later, on July 19th. I got a call from my mother, her voice tight with worry. Have you talked to your sister recently? Not since the other day. Why? She hasn't been to work in 2 days. Bill at Montague's called looking for her, and when I went to her dorm to check on her, she wasn't there. Her roommate said she hasn't seen Carrie since Friday night. It was Monday. Carrie had been missing for over 2 days. Did you call the police? I asked, already knowing it was a stupid question. Your father called Sheriff Morrison's office. They said she's probably just off with friends. You know how college kids are. They said to give it another day or two before filing a missing persons report. Of course, that's what they said. Of course, Sheriff Morrison's department wasn't going to look very hard for a girl who'd been investigating them. I'm sure she's fine, I heard myself say, though every instinct I had was screaming that she wasn't fine, that something was very wrong. You know Carrie, she's impulsive. She probably went to Des Moines or Iowa City with friends and forgot to tell anyone. My mother wanted to believe this. I could hear the relief in her voice as she latched onto the explanation. You're probably right. She did mention wanting to go to Iowa City to use the university library there. I'm sure she'll turn up soon. But Carrie didn't turn up on Tuesday or Wednesday. By Thursday, even my father was starting to show signs of real worry. He went to the sheriff's department himself and demanded they start looking for her. Sheriff Morrison personally assured him that they were doing everything they could, that they'd put out bulletins to surrounding counties, that they were sure she'd turn up safe and sound any day now. The sixth sign, the one that still makes me sick to my stomach when I think about it. came on Friday, July 23rd, at about 3 in the afternoon. I was home from school, making dinner and trying not to let my panic about Carrie consume me. The phone rang, and when I answered, there was a long pause before anyone spoke. "Ellie?" It was Carrie's voice, but wrong somehow. Strained, scared. "Carrie! Oh my God, where are you? We've all been worried sick. Listen to me carefully." She interrupted. "I don't have much time. I found proof, Ellie. Real proof about Kevin Morrison and what happened to Jenny Callahan. I found—" There was a sound in the background, like a door opening. Carrie's breathing suddenly became rapid, panicked. "I have to go," she said quickly. "If anything happens to me, look in the—" The line went dead. I stood there with the phone in my hand, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. I immediately tried to call back, but it had been an unknown number, probably a payphone. I called my parents. I called the sheriff's department, even though every cell in my body was screaming that they were the last people I should trust. And then I did something I've regretted for 43 years. I convinced myself I'd misheard, that Carrie had said, "if anything happens," in the hypothetical sense, not the immediate sense, that she was being dramatic and paranoid like always. I told myself that she'd obviously found somewhere safe to stay. Otherwise, how would she have called? I told myself that everything would be fine, that this would all blow over, that by next week, we'd be laughing about how scared we all were. Strategized narrative progression through remaining story sections. I need to continue with this story. I'm currently around 500 words, and need to reach at least 18 Zazozo-Elero. I have completed Section 1, Opening, around 900 words. Section 2, Background and Context, around 500 words. Section 3, Development. I'm in the middle of the warning signs, which needs to be 500, 0 words total. I'm currently at sign 6 out of 8 warning signs in Section 3. I need to complete signs 7 and 8, finish Section 3. Then continue with Sections 4 to 9. Let me continue with the remaining warning signs, and then move through the rest of the story. The 7th sign came that same evening, around 8 p.m. I was pacing around my apartment, unable to eat, unable to sit still, when there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, I found a teenage boy I vaguely recognized from the neighborhood, maybe 15 or 16 years old, standing there with a manila envelope in his hands. "Are you Eleanor Hartwell?" he asked nervously. "Yes. Who are you?" "I'm Tom Mitchell. A lady gave me $5 to deliver this to you. She said it was really important and that I shouldn't tell anyone I gave it to you." He thrust the envelope into my hands and practically ran back down the stairs before I could ask any more questions. I closed the door and stared at the envelope. It was sealed. With my name written on the front in handwriting I immediately recognized as Carrie's. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside were 3 things: a handwritten letter, a roll of film, and a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been torn from an official document. I started with the letter. "Ellie," it read. "If you're reading this, then either something has happened to me or I got paranoid for nothing, and you can laugh at me later. I hope it's the second one. But just in case, you need to know everything. The film contains photos I took of Kevin Morrison and his friends at Miller's Quarry on the night of June 15th. Jenny Callahan's car was found crashed near there. Remember? I have a witness who says Jenny was at a party there that night, that Kevin and his friends got her drunk even though she kept saying no, and that something happened. Something bad. The witness is too scared to come forward officially, but they told me where to find evidence. The document is a tox report from Jenny's autopsy that shows she had rohypnol in her system. You know, roofies, the date rape drug. That wasn't in the official accident report. Someone made sure it disappeared. I have copies hidden in multiple places. If anything happens to me, take this to the FBI or the state police, anyone except local law enforcement. I love you, and I'm sorry I got you involved in this. But someone needs to know the truth. C. I sat down hard on my couch, the letter clutched in my trembling hands. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't Carrie being dramatic or seeing conspiracies where there were none. This was real. She had evidence of a cover-up, evidence that Jenny Callahan had been drugged and possibly assaulted before her death, evidence that Sheriff Morrison had buried to protect his son. And she was missing. I should have gone to the FBI that night. I should have driven straight to the federal building in Cedar Rapids and handed over everything Carrie had given me. But I was terrified. If Sheriff Morrison had made evidence disappear in an autopsy report, if he was willing to cover up whatever his son had done to Jenny Callahan, what would he do to protect that cover-up if someone threatened to expose it? What had he already done to Carrie? I hid the envelope in the back of my closet, behind a box of winter clothes. I told myself I'd decide what to do in the morning, when I could think more clearly. I told myself that Carrie was probably fine, that she was probably just lying low until she figured out her next move. I was still telling myself these lies when the 8th and final sign came the next morning, Saturday, July 24th. The call came at 6:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the clock on my nightstand, unable to sleep, when the phone rang. It was Sheriff Morrison himself. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his voice solemn and heavy. "I'm afraid I have some very difficult news. We found your sister's car at Miller's Quarry, and we found Carrie. I'm so very sorry." The world stopped, just completely stopped. "What do you mean you found her? She appears to have driven off the access road into the quarry. The car went into the water. By the time we pulled her out. I'm so sorry. She didn't make it." "No," I heard myself say. "No, that can't be right. Carrie wouldn't. She's a good driver. She would never." "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be difficult to hear. We found empty beer cans in the car, and when the medical examiner did a preliminary examination, it appeared that Carrie's blood alcohol level was significantly elevated. It looks like she was driving drunk and lost control of the vehicle." I literally laughed. I know how that sounds, but I laughed because it was so absurd, so obviously a lie. "Carrie doesn't drink, Sheriff. She never has. Young people sometimes make choices their families don't know about," he said, his tone gentle and patronizing in a way that made me want to scream. "I know this is hard to accept, but sometimes our loved ones aren't exactly who we think they are. Where is she? I want to see her." "She's been taken to Black Hawk County Hospital. The medical examiner will need to do a full autopsy, but that's just procedure. I'll need you and your parents to come down and make a formal identification." I don't remember much about the rest of that day. I remember calling my parents and hearing my mother's scream when I told her. I remember James driving us to the hospital because I was shaking too hard to be behind the wheel. I remember walking into the morgue and seeing Carrie's body on the metal table, her skin too pale, her lips blue, her hair still damp from the quarry water. I remember looking at her face and seeing a small bruise on her temple that the medical examiner said was consistent with hitting her head on the steering wheel during the crash. I remember the way her hands were positioned and thinking that something looked wrong about it, though I couldn't articulate what. I remember Sheriff Morrison standing in the corner of the room, watching me with an expression that might have been sympathy, but felt more like calculation. I remember him asking me if Carrie had seemed upset or depressed lately, if I knew of any reason she might want to hurt herself, and I remember saying no, over and over while my mother sobbed into my father's chest. And I remember going home that night and pulling out the manila envelope Carrie had sent me, staring at it for hours, trying to decide what to do. The letter said to take it to the FBI if anything happened to her. Well, something had happened, the worst possible something. But I was scared, so scared, because if Sheriff Morrison had killed my sister, and I knew in my bones that's what had happened, that this was no accident, then he would kill anyone who threatened to expose him. He would kill me. He would kill James. He would kill my parents if he had to. And so I made the worst decision of my life. I took that envelope, and I hid it. I hid it and I kept quiet. And I let Sheriff Morrison's version of events become the official story. I let him tell everyone that Carrie had been troubled, that she'd been drinking, that it was a tragic accident, born of poor judgment and youthful recklessness. I stood at her funeral 3 days later and listened to people whisper about how surprising it was that sweet Carrie had been drinking and driving. I watched my parents age 10 years in 10 minutes as they listened to the priest talk about God's mysterious plans and the danger of making bad choices. I felt Sheriff Morrison's hand on my shoulder as he offered his condolences, felt the weight of his unspoken message. Keep quiet, or you'll end up like your sister. And I kept quiet. For 43 years, I kept quiet. The weeks and months after Carrie's death were a blur of gray numbness, punctuated by moments of sharp, unbearable pain. My parents retreated into themselves, my father becoming even more silent and withdrawn than usual, my mother throwing herself into church activities with a manic energy that worried everyone who knew her. James tried to be supportive, but he didn't understand why I couldn't seem to move past my grief the way everyone expected me to. It was an accident, he'd say gently when he'd find me crying at 3 a.m. A terrible, tragic accident. But you can't blame yourself. But I did blame myself, not for the accident, because it wasn't an accident, but for my silence, for my cowardice, for choosing my own safety over justice for my sister. The official investigation was perfunctory at best. The medical examiner's report stated that Carrie had died from drowning, with a blood alcohol content of 0.18, more than twice the legal limit. There were minor injuries consistent with a car accident, the bruise on her temple, some scrapes on her arms, bruising on her torso from the seatbelt. The official conclusion was accidental death due to driving while intoxicated. I attended the closed hearing where this determination was made. I sat in a small room at the courthouse with my parents and listened to Sheriff Morrison present the evidence. He was thorough, professional, sympathetic. He showed photographs of Carrie's car being pulled from the quarry. He presented the beer cans found in the vehicle, 6 empty Budweiser cans on the floor of the back seat. He explained how the access road to Miller's Quarry was poorly maintained and dark at night, how easy it would be for an impaired driver to miss the curve and go straight off into the water. He never mentioned that Carrie had been investigating him. He never mentioned that she'd been missing for several days before her body was found. He never mentioned the phone call she'd made to me hours before her death, the desperate, "if anything happens to me" warning. When he asked if anyone had questions or concerns about the findings, I felt my father's hand grip my knee under the table, a silent warning to stay quiet. I opened my mouth and then closed it again, and the moment passed. The case was closed. Carrie's death was ruled accidental. Life was supposed to go on. But I couldn't let it go on. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I went through the motions of my life, teaching my classes, coming home to James, attending church on Sundays. But I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body, like I'd become a ghost, haunting my own existence. 3 months after Carrie died in October of 1982, I developed the film she'd sent me. I told James I was going to a teachers' conference in Iowa City for the weekend. Instead, I drove to Cedar Rapids and found a photo processing place far enough from home that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. I dropped off the film and came back 3 days later to pick up the developed pictures. What I saw in those photographs made me physically ill. There were 12 shots in total, all taken at Miller's Quarry, on what the date stamp indicated was June 15, 1982. The quality wasn't great. Carrie had been shooting from a distance, using what looked like a telephoto lens, probably from the woods that surrounded the quarry. But the images were clear enough. They showed a party in progress. Maybe 20 or 25 young people, most of them looking college-aged or slightly older. There were coolers visible, people holding beer bottles, the orange glow of a bonfire. And in several of the photos, I could clearly identify Kevin Morrison. He was 22 at the time, a big guy like his father, with the same dark hair and the same way of carrying himself like he owned whatever space he occupied. In one photo, Kevin had his arm around a girl who looked young, maybe 18 or 19. She was wearing jeans and a yellow tank top, and her posture suggested she was uncomfortable, leaning slightly away from him even as his arm pulled her close. I couldn't be certain, but I thought it might be Jenny Callahan. The timing was right. Jenny had died the night of June 15th. Another photo showed Kevin and 2 other young men. I recognized them as his usual crowd, guys who'd been a few years ahead of me in high school, apparently arguing with someone just outside the frame. Kevin's face was red, his mouth open mid-shout, one hand raised in a gesture that looked threatening. The third photo was the most damning. It showed a girl, the same one from the earlier photo, possibly Jenny, sitting on the ground near the edge of the quarry, her head hanging down, her hair obscuring her face. She looked wrong, her posture too loose, too uncontrolled. In the background, Kevin and his friends were watching her, and their expressions. God, their expressions. Not concerned, not worried, calculating. These photos supported exactly what Carrie had told me in her letter. They showed Kevin Morrison at a party at the quarry on the night a girl died. They showed that girl in visible distress. They suggested, without proving conclusively, that something bad had happened there. But were they enough to reopen the investigation into Jenny Callahan's death? Were they enough to prove that Carrie had been murdered to keep her quiet? I didn't know. I wasn't a lawyer or a police officer or an investigative journalist like Carrie had wanted to be. I was a 4th-grade teacher who was in way over her head. I took those photographs home and hid them with the letter and the toxicology report in a locked box in the back of my closet. And I waited. I waited for my grief to make sense, for the pain to become manageable, for some sign of what I was supposed to do with the knowledge I carried. Days turned into weeks, turned into months. My parents gradually started to function again, though they were never quite the same. James and I tried to maintain normalcy. I taught my classes. Life moved forward. The first anniversary of Carrie's death came and went in July of 1983. My parents held a small memorial service at the cemetery where Carrie was buried. Sheriff Morrison attended, standing at a respectful distance with his wife, offering his sympathies once again. I watched him that day. Really watched him, trying to see if there was any guilt in his eyes, any crack in his facade. He looked back at me with the same steady, calm gaze he'd had since I was a child. The face of a man who slept well at night because he believed his own lies, or simply didn't care about the truth. That was the day I first started to plan. Not consciously, not yet. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a seed was planted. The knowledge that Sheriff Morrison had gotten away with murder. The understanding that he would keep getting away with it unless someone stopped him. The growing certainty that I was the only person who knew the whole truth. 2 years passed, then 5, then 10. The manila envelope stayed hidden in my closet, its contents a guilty secret I could never quite bring myself to expose or destroy. I built a life around that secret. James and I had our first daughter, Sarah, in 1985. Our second daughter, Amanda, followed in 1987. I poured myself into motherhood, into teaching, into the daily tasks of living that kept me too busy to think too hard about what I knew and what I'd failed to do. My parents died within 6 months of each other in 1992. My father had a heart attack at the age of 64. My mother, who had never quite recovered from losing Carrie, simply seemed to fade away. I think she died of a broken heart, though the death certificate said pneumonia. At their funeral, I noticed that Sheriff Morrison was starting to look old. He was in his 50s by then, his hair going gray, his belly even more substantial. But he still had power. He was still the sheriff. He was still untouchable. James's father died in 1995, and James took over the insurance agency full-time. We finally bought a house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch on the west side of town. Our daughters grew up, went to college, started their own lives. I kept teaching. James kept selling insurance. We were ordinary people living an ordinary life in a town where extraordinary evil had been buried and forgotten. But I never forgot. Not for a single day. Every year on July 23rd, I would wake up and think, today is the day my sister was murdered. Every time I saw Sheriff Morrison around town, at the grocery store, at church, at high school football games, I would think, that man killed Carrie and got away with it. In 1998, Sheriff Robert Morrison announced his retirement after 34 years in law enforcement. There was a big celebration, testimonials about his dedicated service, a plaque presented by the county commissioners. He gave a speech about his pride in serving the community and his confidence in his deputy chief, who would be running for sheriff in the next election. I attended that retirement party. I stood in the back of the American Legion Hall with a glass of punch I didn't drink and listened to people praise a murderer. Kevin Morrison was there too, now in his late 30s, married with kids of his own, running his grandfather's farm equipment business. He looked prosperous and respectable, a pillar of the community just like his father. They'd both gotten away with it. Completely, totally, absolutely gotten away with it. That night I went home and pulled out the manila envelope for the first time in years. I looked at the photographs, read Carrie's letter again, examined the toxicology report, and I made a decision. I was 39 years old. My daughters were 11 and 13. I had, hopefully, decades of life ahead of me, and I was done being afraid. But I also understood something crucial. You don't go after people like Robert Morrison by going to the police or the newspapers or the official channels. Those channels had been closed off decades ago. If I was going to get justice for Carrie, I was going to have to be smart, patient, and strategic. So I started to plan. Really plan. This time. Not the vague, someday intentions I'd had at Carrie's funeral, but a concrete strategy for exposing the truth in a way that couldn't be covered up or dismissed. The thing about waiting 16 years to seek justice is that it gives you a lot of time to think, a lot of time to plan, A lot of time to understand exactly what you're up against and what tools you have available. And one thing I learned during those years of watching and waiting was that powerful men always, eventually, make mistakes. You just have to be patient enough to wait for them. My first step was research. In 1998, the internet was becoming more mainstream, though not like it is today. But it was enough. I started spending my lunch breaks at the Cedar Falls Public Library, using their computers to search for information. I wasn't looking for anything about Carrie or Jenny Callahan anymore. Those cases were cold and buried. Instead, I was looking for patterns. I searched news archives from the Des Moines Register, the Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier, even some regional papers from surrounding counties. I was looking for any story that involved Kevin Morrison or his associates. Any accident, any incident, anything that might have been quietly swept under the rug. What I found was disturbing, but not surprising. Over the course of 20 years, there were at least a dozen incidents that had Kevin Morrison's fingerprints all over them, even if his name never appeared in the official reports. A hit-and-run in 1985, where the suspect was described as driving a vehicle that matched Kevin's truck, but the case was never solved. A bar fight in 1989, where 3 people were hospitalized, but no charges were filed. A complaint from a young woman in 1992 about harassment, quickly withdrawn. The pattern was clear. Kevin Morrison did whatever he wanted, and his father made the problems disappear. And now, even with Robert Morrison retired, Kevin still seemed to operate with impunity. The new sheriff, Tom Brennan, had been Robert Morrison's deputy for 15 years. He wasn't going to rock the boat. But Kevin wasn't my main focus. Robert Morrison was. Because Robert Morrison had killed my sister. Kevin might have been the reason, the secret that needed protecting. But Robert had done the actual deed. He'd made Carrie disappear. He'd staged her death to look like a drunk driving accident. He'd buried the evidence and intimidated anyone who might ask questions. And I was going to prove it. My second step was building a network. This took years, but I was patient. I started with subtle inquiries, careful conversations with people who might have known something. I volunteered at the Black Hawk County Historical Society, which gave me access to old newspaper archives and county records that weren't digitized yet. I joined a book club that met at the library, which put me in contact with other women my age who'd grown up in Cedar Falls and remembered the events of the early 1980s. One of those women was Patricia Henderson, who'd been a year behind me in school. Her husband had been a deputy under Sheriff Morrison in the 80s. Over coffee one day in 2001, she mentioned that her husband had always felt uncomfortable about some of the cases that got closed without proper investigation. "He never said much about it," Patricia confided, stirring cream into her coffee with a small silver spoon. "But I could tell some things bothered him. He'd come home from work looking troubled, and when I'd ask what was wrong, he'd just say he had to follow orders." "Do you remember any specific cases?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Patricia thought for a moment. "There was a girl who died in a car accident in the early 80s, Jenny something. My husband said the scene didn't look quite right to him, but Sheriff Morrison insisted it was just a drunk driving accident. And then there was your sister." "I'm so sorry about that, Ellie. My husband said he thought the timeline of events was off. But again, Sheriff Morrison was very clear about how things had happened." My heart was pounding, but I kept my expression neutral. "Your husband sounds like he was a good man, someone who cared about doing things right." "He was," Patricia said sadly. Her husband had died of cancer in 1997. He kept journals, you know. Every day he worked, he'd write down what happened, what bothered him. what he wished he could have done differently. I still have them, boxes of them in my attic. I keep meaning to go through them, but it's too hard. I waited a week before asking, very carefully, if I could help her sort through her late husband's journals. She was grateful for the offer. In those journals, I found gold. Deputy James Henderson had been a meticulous chronicler of his unease with Sheriff Morrison's methods. He'd noted the Jenny Callahan case in detail, the inconsistencies in the accident scene, the missing toxicology reports, the pressure from Morrison to close the case quickly. He'd written about Carrie's case, too, how the timeline of her disappearance didn't match up with when her car supposedly went into the quarry, how the beer cans in her car looked staged, how the medical examiner had noted some bruising that seemed inconsistent with a car accident. James Henderson hadn't been able to do anything with his suspicions while he was alive. He'd had a wife and kids to support, and going against Sheriff Morrison would have meant losing his job at minimum, possibly worse. But he'd documented everything, perhaps hoping that someday someone would care enough to ask questions. I photocopied every relevant page of those journals. Patricia never asked why I was so interested in cases from 20 years ago. Maybe she suspected. Maybe she just didn't want to know. My third step was the hardest. I had to wait for the right opportunity. For years, I gathered information and watched and waited. I watched Kevin Morrison's continued rise in the business community. I watched Robert Morrison enjoy his retirement, playing golf and traveling with his wife and being a doting grandfather to his many grandchildren. I watched the years pass and wondered if I'd ever get my chance. In 2005, everything changed. Kevin Morrison, now 45 years old, was arrested for DUI. It happened in Johnson County, outside of Black Hawk County jurisdiction, which meant Sheriff Brennan couldn't make it disappear. Kevin had been driving drunk and had crashed his car into a utility pole. He was alone, thankfully. No one else was hurt. But he was arrested, charged, and actually had to face consequences for once in his life. It should have been a minor thing, a DUI, a fine, maybe some community service for a first-time offender. But Kevin's lawyer made a mistake. He tried to argue that Kevin shouldn't be held to the same standard as an ordinary citizen because of his family's standing in the community, because of his father's years of service as sheriff, because he was a respected businessman. The judge, a woman named Margaret Chen, who'd been appointed to the bench just 2 years earlier and wasn't beholden to the old boy's network, was not impressed. In fact, she was furious. She gave a speech from the bench about how no one was above the law, about how family connections and community standing meant nothing when you endangered other people's lives by driving drunk. And then she sentenced Kevin Morrison to the maximum penalty: 6 months in jail, 3 years probation, mandatory alcohol counseling, and a 5-year license suspension. The Cedar Falls community was shocked. Kevin Morrison going to jail for a simple DUI. It seemed impossibly harsh to people who'd grown up believing that the Morrisons were untouchable. But I saw it for what it was: an opportunity. Robert Morrison, now 68 years old and 7 years into his retirement, was devastated by his son's imprisonment. He aged visibly during those 6 months, his health beginning to fail in ways that became noticeable around town, and he started talking. Not about Carrie or Jenny Callahan or any of the cases he'd buried, but about his son, about how unfair the system was, about how that activist judge had it out for their family. He made a critical mistake. He started drinking. Robert Morrison had never been much of a drinker before, but stress and age and fear for his son's future made him turn to alcohol in a way he never had before. And alcohol, as I was about to learn, makes even careful men careless. I started going to the same bar Morrison frequented, A place called O'Malley's, on the north side of town. I didn't go often, just once every week or two, always sitting alone at the bar with a single glass of wine that I nursed for hours. I became a familiar face, unremarkable, forgettable. Just another middle-aged woman having a quiet drink. And I listened. Morrison liked to hold court at O'Malley's, surrounded by his old cronies from the sheriff's department and various hangers-on, who still treated him like he was important. They'd talk about the old days, about cases they'd worked, about how things used to be better before all these regulations and oversight committees got involved. One night in December 2005, about 3 months into Kevin's jail sentence, Morrison had too much to drink. His friends had mostly gone home, and he was sitting at the bar alone, nursing his 4th or 5th whiskey, when he started talking to the bartender about how unfair it all was. "My boy's a good kid," he slurred, his words running together. "Made some mistakes, sure, but who hasn't? That judge acted like he killed someone." I was sitting 3 seats down, apparently absorbed in a magazine I wasn't really reading. The bartender, a young guy who probably hadn't even been born when Carrie died, made sympathetic noises. "It does seem harsh for a first offense." "First offense?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "First offense that actually went to trial, you mean? I protected that boy for years, kept him out of trouble, cleaned up his messes, made problems go away. And this is the thanks I get? Some bitch of a judge decides to make an example of him." My blood ran cold, but I kept my eyes on my magazine. "That's tough, Sheriff," the bartender said. "Must have been stressful, having to deal with that stuff." "You have no idea," Morrison said, gesturing with his glass so emphatically that whiskey sloshed onto the bar. "The things I did for that boy, the people I had to." He trailed off, staring into his glass. The bartender wiped up the spilled whiskey and moved down the bar to help another customer. I waited a few minutes, then casually moved to the seat next to Morrison. "Sheriff Morrison," I said, as if I'd just noticed him. "Eleanor Hartwell, Richard and Dorothy's daughter." He looked at me with red, unfocused eyes. "Ellie, right. How are you doing?" "I'm well, thank you. I heard about Kevin. I'm sorry. That must be difficult for your family." Something in my tone, the sympathy without judgment, seemed to open a floodgate. Morrison started talking and I just listened, and occasionally prompted him with gentle questions. He talked about Kevin's troubles over the years, about how hard it was to be a father and a sheriff at the same time, about the impossible choices he'd had to make. "People don't understand," he said, his words slurring even more now. "They think it's easy, protecting your family. But sometimes you gotta do things, hard things, things that keep you up at night." "I'm sure you always did what you thought was right," I said quietly. "Right. Sure. Right." He laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "Is it right to bury evidence? Is it right to make sure witnesses keep quiet? Is it right to—" He stopped himself, seemed to realize he was saying too much. He looked at me with sudden suspicion, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "You're Dorothy's girl, the one whose sister—" "Carrie," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "Yes, that was my sister." We stared at each other for a long moment. Something passed between us, an understanding that we both knew more than we'd ever said aloud. Then Morrison stumbled to his feet, threw some bills on the bar, and left without another word. But he'd said enough. In his drunken ramblings, he'd essentially confessed to covering up crimes to protect Kevin. He hadn't specifically mentioned Carrie or Jenny, but the implication was clear. And if he'd confessed to that in a public bar, who knew what else he might say given the right circumstances? That night was in December 2005. I went home and pulled out my box of evidence. Carrie's letter, the photographs, the toxicology report, the photocopied pages from Deputy Henderson's journals. And I added to it notes from Morrison's conversation at the bar, everything I could remember him saying. Then I started the final phase of my plan. Over the next several months, I did something I'd never done before. I started documenting everything in a way that would be undeniable. I bought a small voice recorder and started carrying it with me whenever I went to places Morrison might be. I didn't record him illegally. Iowa is a one-party consent state, meaning I could record conversations I was part of. But I positioned myself to become part of those conversations. I ran into him at the grocery store and mentioned how hard it must be to have your son in jail. He responded with anger about the injustice of it all. I saw him at a community event and expressed sympathy for his family. He responded with increasingly bitter comments about the things he'd had to do as sheriff that nobody appreciated. Slowly, carefully, over the course of a year, I collected fragments of his guilt. Never a full confession, nothing that would be admissible in court on its own, but a pattern, a record of a man struggling with the weight of his crimes. In 2007, two things happened that made me realize my window of opportunity was closing. First, Robert Morrison was diagnosed with prostate cancer. It was aggressive, and the prognosis wasn't good. Second, Kevin Morrison was released from jail and immediately started working on rehabilitating his image, making large charitable donations, and getting involved in community boards. I realized that if I didn't act soon, Morrison would die with his secrets intact, and Kevin would continue to operate with impunity for the rest of his life. Carrie would never get justice. Jenny Callahan would never get justice. All the other victims would stay buried and forgotten. But how do you expose a decades-old murder committed by someone who controlled the very institutions that were supposed to investigate crimes? How do you get justice when every local authority has either been complicit or has looked the other way? The answer came to me one afternoon in April 2007 when I was reading the newspaper and saw an article about the Iowa State Attorney General's new cold case unit. They were specifically looking at old cases that might have been mishandled or inadequately investigated. They were accepting tips and evidence from the public. I had all the evidence I needed. I had Carrie's original letter and photos. I had the toxicology report. I had Deputy Henderson's journals documenting his concerns. I had my own recordings of Morrison's drunken hints at guilt. I had 43 years of determined research and careful documentation. It was time, but I still had to be smart about how I presented it. I couldn't just show up at the Attorney General's office with a box of evidence and expect them to immediately launch an investigation into a former sheriff. I needed to build a narrative, create a timeline, present everything in a way that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. So I typed it all up. Every detail, every piece of evidence, every connection. I created a comprehensive document, over 100 pages long, that laid out exactly what had happened to Jenny Callahan and to Carrie, and exactly how Sheriff Robert Morrison had covered it up. I made 3 copies of everything. One I sent via certified mail to the Iowa Attorney General's cold case unit. One I sent to the FBI field office in Cedar Rapids. And one I kept for myself, locked in a safety deposit box at a bank, with instructions that if anything happened to me, it should be sent to the New York Times. Then I waited. The response to my submissions wasn't immediate, and it wasn't dramatic in the way you might see on television crime shows. There were no police cars showing up at Robert Morrison's house, no handcuffs, no perp walks. What happened instead was a slow, methodical grinding of the wheels of justice that had been still for far too long. In June 2007, I received a letter from the Iowa Attorney General's office acknowledging receipt of my materials and informing me that they were reviewing them. 3 months later, in September, I got a phone call from an investigator named Sarah Martinez, who wanted to meet with me in person. We met at a coffee shop in Waterloo, far enough from Cedar Falls that we wouldn't run into anyone I knew. Sarah Martinez was in her early 30s, sharp-eyed and serious, with a notebook that she filled with meticulous notes as I talked. I told her everything. Every detail of Carrie's investigation, every warning sign I'd missed, every piece of evidence I'd collected over the past 25 years. She listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. When I was done, she sat back and studied me carefully. "Mrs. Hartwell, what you're describing is a complex conspiracy involving a law enforcement officer who was well respected in his community. Building a case against someone like that, especially this many years later, is going to be extremely difficult." "I understand that," I said, "but it's the truth, and I have evidence to support it." "The photographs are compelling," she admitted. "The toxicology report is interesting. Deputy Henderson's journals are useful for establishing a pattern of concern, but none of this definitively proves that Sheriff Morrison murdered your sister." "What about his own words?" I asked. "The recordings I made of him talking about covering up crimes?" "He never specifically mentions your sister in those recordings. A good defense attorney would argue he was just a frustrated old man venting about the general difficulties of law enforcement, not confessing to murder." I felt my carefully built hopes starting to crumble. "So you're saying there's nothing you can do?" "I'm not saying that at all," Sarah said quickly. "I'm saying that what we have here is enough to launch an investigation, but probably not enough to prosecute. We need more. We need to find other people who knew what happened, who might be willing to talk now that Morrison is sick and no longer has power. We need to build a stronger case." "How do we do that?" "We start by looking at everyone who was close to Morrison during the relevant time period. Deputies who worked for him, administrative staff, people who might have seen or heard things that made them uncomfortable. We look at Kevin Morrison's associates from the early 80s, anyone who might have been at that party at Miller's Quarry. We build a network of potential witnesses, and we interview them, carefully and methodically." "That could take years," I said, feeling exhausted at the thought. "It probably will," Sarah agreed. "But Mrs. Hartwell, you've already waited 25 years. If you want real justice for your sister, if you want to make absolutely certain that this case holds up in court, then you need to be patient a little longer." So, I was patient. For another 3 years I was patient while Sarah Martinez and her team conducted their investigation. They interviewed over 50 people. They tracked down former deputies who'd left the sheriff's department under Morrison, and several of them confirmed that they'd felt pressured to close cases without proper investigation. They found 3 people who'd been at the party at Miller's Quarry the night Jenny Callahan died, and while none of them would admit to seeing a crime, their careful non-denials and nervous evasions suggested they knew more than they were saying. They exhumed Jenny Callahan's body and conducted a new autopsy. The original toxicology report showing rohypnol in her system was confirmed. The original medical examiner who'd conducted the 1979 autopsy was dead, but his assistant was still alive, and when pressed, admitted that Sheriff Morrison had personally ordered certain findings to be excluded from the final report. They couldn't exhume Carrie's body. My parents had had her cremated, a decision I'd always regretted. But they found new evidence anyway. A former tow truck operator came forward and said he'd been the one to pull Carrie's car out of the quarry, and he'd always thought it was strange that the car showed evidence of having been submerged for several days, even though it supposedly went into the water just hours before it was found. The water damage pattern didn't match up with the official timeline. A former medical examiner's assistant remembered processing Carrie's body and being surprised by bruising on her arms and torso that seemed inconsistent with a car accident. She'd been a young intern at the time and hadn't felt she had the authority to question the senior medical examiner's conclusions, but the marks had bothered her for years. A former waitress from Montague's came forward to say that Carrie had confided in her about investigating the Morrison family, and that she'd seen Kevin Morrison follow Carrie out of the restaurant on multiple occasions in a way that seemed threatening. Piece by piece, the case was being built, and in February 2010, 28 years after my sister's death, the Iowa Attorney General's office filed charges, not against Robert Morrison. He'd died 3 months earlier, in November 2009, his prostate cancer having spread to his bones, and then everywhere else. He died at home surrounded by his family, probably still believing he'd gotten away with everything. The charges were filed against Kevin Morrison for the murder of Jenny Callahan and for conspiracy to cover up a crime in connection with Carrie's death. There wasn't enough evidence to charge him directly with Carrie's murder. We couldn't prove he'd been the one to actually kill her. But the evidence that he'd been involved in the cover-up was substantial. Kevin Morrison, now 50 years old, was arrested at his office at Morrison Farm Equipment. The news spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. The community was divided. Some people believed the charges, finally understanding that the Morrison family's long record of escaping consequences had been built on corruption and violence. Others insisted it was a witch hunt, that Kevin was being persecuted because of his father's former position, that the Attorney General's office had some political agenda. I didn't care what they believed. I cared that Kevin Morrison was finally facing consequences. I cared that Carrie's story was finally being told. I cared that the truth, after nearly 3 decades, was finally coming to light. The trial was scheduled for September 2010. In the months leading up to it, Sarah Martinez prepared me to testify. We went over my timeline of events dozens of times. We reviewed every piece of evidence I'd collected. We anticipated every question the defense might ask and prepared answers that were truthful but strategic. James was supportive, though I could tell the whole thing was taking a toll on him. He was 62 now, thinking about retirement, and instead he was dealing with his wife being at the center of a sensational murder trial. Our daughters, Sarah and Amanda, were confused and concerned. They'd grown up knowing their Aunt Carrie had died in a car accident before they were born. Learning that she'd actually been murdered, and that I'd known about it for decades without saying anything, was difficult for them to process. "Why didn't you say something sooner, Mom?" Amanda asked me one night when she came to visit. She was 23, the same age Carrie had been when she'd first started asking dangerous questions. "Why did you wait so long?" "Because I was afraid," I told her honestly. "I was afraid of what would happen to me, to your father, to you and your sister. I was afraid that if I spoke up, we'd all end up like Carrie." "So you just let her murderer walk free for 30 years? "Yes," I said, feeling the weight of that admission. "I did, and I will regret that for the rest of my life, but I'm trying to make it right now." "Is it enough?" she asked. "After all this time, is it enough?" I didn't have an answer for her. The trial of Kevin Morrison for the murder of Jennifer Callahan and conspiracy to obstruct justice in the death of Caroline Hartwell began on September 13, 2010, in the Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines. The venue had been changed from Black Hawk County due to concerns about finding an impartial jury in Cedar Falls, where the Morrison name still carried weight with half the population. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with James beside me, watching as the prosecution laid out the case that Sarah Martinez and her team had spent 3 years building. It was surreal to hear Carrie's story told in the formal language of legal proceedings, to see photographs of my sister projected on screens for the jury, to watch as detail after detail of what had happened was carefully, methodically presented. The prosecution's case was comprehensive. They started with Jenny Callahan, establishing through witness testimony and the newly revealed toxicology evidence that she'd been drugged with Rohypnol and sexually assaulted at a party at Miller's Quarry on June 15, 1979. They presented the photographs Carrie had taken of that party, showing Kevin Morrison present at the scene. They brought in witnesses who testified that they'd been at the party and had seen Kevin and his friends give Jenny drinks, that they'd seen her become increasingly incapacitated, that they'd been told to leave and not talk about what they'd seen. One witness, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been 18 at the time and was now 50, broke down in tears on the stand as she described watching Jenny stumble toward the edge of the quarry and then disappear. She hadn't seen what happened next, but she'd heard Kevin Morrison telling his friends they needed to handle this and make sure it looked right. The prosecution established that Jenny's car had been found crashed into a tree several miles from the quarry, and that the medical examiner's report had been altered to remove evidence of sexual assault and Rohypnol in her system. They presented testimony from the former assistant medical examiner, who confirmed that Sheriff Robert Morrison had personally ordered these alterations. Then they moved to Carrie's case. They established through my testimony and the documents Carrie had left that she'd been investigating Kevin Morrison and had gathered evidence of his involvement in Jenny's death. They presented the timeline of Carrie's disappearance, showing that she'd been missing for several days before her car was found in Miller's Quarry. They brought in the tow truck operator, who testified about the inconsistencies in the water damage to Carrie's car. They brought in the former medical examiner's assistant, who testified about the suspicious bruising on Carrie's body. They presented Deputy James Henderson's journals, which documented his concerns about both cases. The prosecution argued that Kevin Morrison had killed Jenny Callahan, either intentionally or through reckless indifference to her life while she was incapacitated, and that his father had covered it up. They argued that when Carrie began investigating 3 years later, Kevin Morrison had killed her too, and again his father had covered it up by staging it to look like a drunk driving accident. The defense's strategy was to attack the timeline and the credibility of witnesses who had waited 30 years to come forward. Kevin Morrison's attorney, a slick lawyer from Chicago named Theodore Barnes, argued that there was no direct evidence linking Kevin to either death. He pointed out that the photographs from the party showed Kevin present, but didn't show him committing any crime. He argued that witnesses who'd been teenagers in 1979 couldn't be trusted to remember events accurately from 3 decades ago. He suggested that Carrie's death had indeed been an accident, that she'd been a troubled young woman who'd developed a drinking problem that her family hadn't known about. He attacked me personally, suggesting that I'd manufactured evidence and twisted facts because I couldn't accept that my sister had died in a preventable accident. He implied that I'd been obsessed with the Morrison family for decades and had built an elaborate conspiracy theory to justify that obsession. It was brutal. There were days when I left the courthouse feeling like I'd been physically beaten, when I questioned whether going through all of this was worth it. Theodore Barnes was good at his job, and he made me doubt my own memories, my own perception of events. But the prosecution had one piece of evidence that the defense couldn't explain away: Robert Morrison's own words. Sarah Martinez had gotten a warrant to search Morrison's personal effects after his death, and they'd found journals. Just like Deputy Henderson, Robert Morrison had kept detailed records of his years as sheriff. But unlike Henderson's journals, which were filled with moral qualms and second-guessing, Morrison's were cold and calculating. He'd written about covering up Jenny's death, about making sure the toxicology report was altered, about pressuring witnesses to keep quiet. He'd written about Carrie's investigation, about how she was becoming a problem that needed to be handled. And in an entry dated July 20th, 1982, 3 days before Carrie's body was found, he'd written, "Spoke with Kay about the Hartwell girl. He understands what needs to be done. This is going to be messy, but we don't have a choice. She knows too much, and she's not going to stop. Have to protect the family." That entry didn't explicitly say, "We're going to kill her," but the implication was clear, and when combined with everything else, the timeline, the physical evidence, the witness testimony, it painted a damning picture. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On October 29th, 2010, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Kevin Morrison was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Jennifer Callahan and conspiracy to obstruct justice in the death of Caroline Hartwell. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, I didn't feel the triumph I'd imagined I'd feel. I didn't feel vindicated or satisfied. I just felt tired. So incredibly tired. 28 years of carrying this secret, of living with the guilt of my silence, of working toward this moment. And now that it had arrived, all I could think about was how it should have happened decades ago. How many years of Carrie's life had been stolen. How many years her real killer had lived free while I'd been too afraid to speak up. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me, asking how I felt, asking if justice had been served, asking what I wanted to say to Kevin Morrison. I didn't have answers for them. I just said, my sister deserved better. Jenny Callahan deserved better. And I hope this brings some measure of peace to their families. Jenny's parents were both dead by then, but her sister was there, a woman in her 50s with tears streaming down her face. She found me in the crowd and hugged me tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for making sure people knew the truth about what happened to Jenny." That hug, that thank you, meant more to me than the guilty verdict. In the aftermath of the trial, Cedar Falls went through a reckoning. The Morrison family, once one of the most powerful and respected names in the community, was thoroughly disgraced. Kevin's wife divorced him. His children changed their last names. The farm equipment business went bankrupt within a year. Robert Morrison's legacy was reassessed. The plaque honoring his service was removed from the county courthouse. The street that had been named after him was renamed. His role in covering up crimes and protecting his son became part of the official historical record of Black Hawk County. For me, the trial's conclusion didn't bring the closure I'd hoped for. If anything, it opened up new wounds. My daughters struggled with understanding why I'd kept silent for so long. Sarah, my older daughter, was particularly angry. She felt I'd betrayed not just Carrie, but every principle of truth and justice I'd supposedly raised her to believe in. "You taught me to stand up for what's right," she said during a particularly painful conversation in 2011, a few months after the trial. "You taught me to speak up when I saw injustice, But you didn't do that yourself, did you? You saw your own sister murdered, and you said nothing for 30 years. You're right, I told her. I was a hypocrite. I was a coward. But Sarah, you have to understand. I was terrified. I truly believed that if I spoke up, Morrison would kill me too. I believed I was protecting you and your sister and your father by staying quiet. So you protected us by letting a murderer walk free, by teaching us through your actions that the truth doesn't matter as much as our own safety. I didn't have a good answer for that. She was right. My fear, however justified it might have been, had led me to make choices that betrayed everything I claimed to believe in. James tried to be supportive, but the stress of the trial and its aftermath took a toll on his health. He'd always had high blood pressure, but in the years following the trial, it became difficult to control even with medication. He developed heart problems. In 2014, at the age of 66, he had a major heart attack. He survived, but it weakened him significantly. I couldn't help but wonder if the stress of what I'd put our family through had contributed to his declining health. He never said as much. James wasn't the type to assign blame or express resentment. But I thought it anyway. Another piece of guilt to carry. The years from 2010 to 2018 were difficult. I retired from teaching in 2013 at the age of 54, earlier than I'd planned. But I couldn't keep doing it. The trial had made me locally famous in a way that made normal life impossible. Parents in Cedar Falls either treated me like a hero for exposing corruption or like a troublemaker who'd dragged the community's name through the mud. Either way, I couldn't just be a regular fourth-grade teacher anymore. James and I sold our house in Cedar Falls and moved to Iowa City, where we weren't as well known, where we could try to build some kind of normal life in our 60s. We bought a small condo near the university, and I tried to figure out who Eleanor Hartwell was when she wasn't defined by her sister's murder and her decades-long quest for justice. I volunteered at the Iowa City Public Library. I joined a book club, a different one with people who didn't know my history. I tried to repair my relationships with my daughters, with varying degrees of success. Sarah eventually came around, though our relationship would never be quite what it had been before. Amanda was more forgiving, or maybe just better at accepting that people are complicated and flawed. I visited Carrie's grave every year on the anniversary of her death. I'd sit there in the cemetery and talk to her, tell her about the trial, about Kevin Morrison rotting in prison, about how sorry I was that it had taken so long. I'd imagine what her life might have been like if she'd lived. She'd be in her 50s now, if she hadn't been murdered at 19. She might have had the journalism career she'd dreamed of. She might have had a family, children, a whole rich life full of experiences and relationships. Instead, she was frozen at 19 forever, her potential unrealized, her voice silenced. In June 2018, James had another heart attack. This one he didn't survive. I found him in the morning, having died peacefully in his sleep. He was 70 years old. The grief of losing James was different from the grief of losing Carrie. But in some ways it was harder. Carrie had been stolen from me suddenly, violently, when we were both young. James had been my partner for 40 years, and his death felt like losing part of myself. The guilt I felt was different too. With Carrie, I felt guilty for not protecting her, for not speaking up sooner. With James, I felt guilty for the stress I'd put him through, for the way my choices had affected his health and his final years. I spent the year after James's death in a fog of grief and regret. My daughters were supportive, but they had their own lives, their own families to take care of. I was 67 years old, alone for the first time in my adult life, trying to figure out what the rest of my existence was supposed to look like. It was during this time that I started writing everything down, not for any particular purpose at first, just as a way to process everything that had happened. I started with my memories of Carrie, the good times before everything went wrong. Then I wrote about the investigation, the trial, the aftermath. I wrote about my guilt and my fear and my long, difficult journey towards something that might eventually resemble peace. As I wrote, I realized something important. My story wasn't just about what had happened to Carrie. It was about the cost of silence. It was about the choice between safety and truth, and the consequences of choosing safety at the expense of everything else. It was about living with regret, and eventually maybe learning to forgive yourself. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was value in sharing this story. Not because I was proud of how I'd handled things. I wasn't. But because maybe someone else, somewhere, was carrying a terrible secret because they were afraid. Maybe someone else was choosing silence because they thought it was the safest option. And maybe hearing my story could help them understand that silence has its own terrible costs, that speaking the truth, even decades late, is better than carrying that burden forever. So here I am, 67 years old, finally telling the complete truth about what happened to my sister Carrie in the summer of 1982. Not because I'm a hero. I'm not. I was a coward for most of my life, and I'll have to live with that. But I'm telling it because Carrie deserves to have her whole story known. She deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, but as a brave young woman who tried to expose corruption and injustice, who asked the right questions even when it was dangerous to do so. She was everything I wasn't. She was courageous where I was fearful. She was determined to speak the truth where I was willing to stay silent. She died trying to make the world a little bit more just, a little bit more honest, and maybe, by finally telling her story in full, by admitting my own failures and cowardice, I can honor her memory in a way I failed to do when she was alive. Now, in 2025, I'm 67 years old, living alone in my condo in Iowa City. Kevin Morrison is still in prison, serving his life sentence. He's 65 now, in failing health according to reports I've seen. Part of me takes grim satisfaction in knowing he's spending his final years behind bars. But mostly I just feel empty about it. No amount of punishment for him will bring Carrie back or give me back the years I spent living in fear and silence. My relationship with my daughters has improved somewhat over the years. They're in their late 30s now, with families of their own. They've named their daughters after Carrie. My granddaughters Caroline and Carrie, ages 8 and 6. When they're old enough to understand, I'll tell them about their great-aunt, about what happened to her, about the importance of speaking up even when it's scary. I'll also tell them about my mistakes, because I think that's important too. I want them to learn from my failures. I want them to understand that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing even when you're terrified. It's choosing truth over safety, even when the cost is high. Recently, I've been doing something I never thought I'd do. I've been speaking at events about justice and truth-telling. Organizations that work with cold cases and victim advocacy have invited me to share my story. At first, I said no. I felt like a fraud, someone who'd stayed silent for 30 years trying to tell other people to speak up. But Sarah Martinez, the investigator who'd worked on Carrie's case, convinced me otherwise. People need to hear your story, she told me when she called to ask me to speak at a conference on cold cases in Chicago. Not because you did everything right. You didn't. But because your story shows that it's never too late to seek justice. It shows that even if you failed to speak up immediately, speaking up eventually still matters. It still makes a difference. So I started accepting speaking invitations. At first, it was terrifying, standing up in front of rooms full of people and admitting all the ways I'd failed Carrie. But I found that people responded to the honesty. Victims' families would come up to me afterward and thank me for not pretending to be perfect, for showing that seeking justice is messy and complicated, and sometimes takes decades. One woman, probably in her 50s, came up to me after a talk I gave in Minneapolis last year. She had tears streaming down her face. "My brother was murdered 20 years ago," she told me. "I've always suspected who did it, but I've been too afraid to say anything. Hearing your story, I think I'm ready now. I think I'm ready to speak up." I gave her Sarah Martinez's contact information and told her about the Iowa Cold Case Unit. I don't know if she followed through, but I hope she did. I hope she found the courage I took so long to find. If I've learned anything from this long, painful journey, it's that silence protects the powerful and abandons the vulnerable. Every day I stayed quiet about what happened to Carrie was a day that Kevin Morrison got to walk around free. A day that Robert Morrison got to pretend he was a good man. A day that the truth stayed buried. I understand why I made the choices I made. I was genuinely afraid. I genuinely believed that speaking up would endanger me and my family. But understanding why I did something doesn't make it right. I should have been braver. I should have trusted that the truth mattered more than my fear. And yet, even saying that, I'm not sure what I would have done differently if I could go back. It's easy now, in 2025, to look back at 1982 and think I should have immediately gone to the FBI with Carrie's evidence. But I remember how scared I was. I remember lying awake at night, convinced that Sheriff Morrison was going to kill me, just like he'd killed Carrie. I remember how powerful he seemed, how impossible it felt to stand up against him. Maybe the real lesson isn't that people should never be afraid. Maybe it's that we need systems and support structures that make it easier for scared people to tell the truth. We need to make sure that when someone tries to expose corruption or injustice, they don't have to do it alone, terrified and vulnerable. Looking back over these past 43 years, I can identify so many moments where things could have gone differently. If I'd been braver when Carrie first told me about her investigation, if I'd taken her phone call more seriously the day she disappeared, if I'd gone to the FBI immediately instead of hiding her evidence for 25 years, if someone, anyone, had been willing to listen to a 19-year-old college student when she tried to tell them about corruption and cover-ups. But none of that happened. Instead, Carrie died, and I spent 3 decades living with the weight of that knowledge, and Kevin Morrison walked around free until I finally found the courage to expose him. I think about the life Carrie could have had. She'd be 62 now. She probably would have become the investigative journalist she dreamed of being. Knowing Carrie, she would have been one of those reporters who fearlessly pursued the truth, who refused to be intimidated or silenced. She might have won awards. She might have changed the world in small but significant ways. Instead, she's buried in a cemetery in Cedar Falls, her gravestone marking a life cut short at 19. I visit her grave less frequently now that I live in Iowa City, but I still go several times a year. I sit there and tell her about my life, about her nieces and her great-nieces, about the world she never got to see. I tell her about the trial, about Kevin Morrison in prison, about how her death finally meant something beyond tragedy. I also apologize. Every single time I apologize for not protecting her, for not being brave enough, for letting so many years pass before I fought for justice on her behalf. I don't know if she can hear me, if there's any part of her consciousness still existing somewhere. But I say it anyway because I need to. The last time I visited was a few weeks ago, in early December. It was cold, the kind of sharp Iowa cold that cuts right through you. I brought flowers, daisies, which were always Carrie's favorite. I sat on the frozen ground next to her headstone and talked for over an hour. I told her about writing all this down, about sharing her story as completely and honestly as I could. I told her that I was trying, finally, to make sure she was remembered not just as a victim, but as someone who tried to do the right thing, who tried to expose the truth even when it was dangerous. And I made her a promise. I promised that for whatever years I have left, I would keep telling her story. I would keep encouraging other people to speak up, to tell their truths, to not make the same mistakes I made. I would do everything I could to make sure that her death, however tragic and unnecessary, would mean something. I can't bring Carrie back. I can't give her the life she should have had. But I can make sure she's remembered, and I can use what happened to her, and what I failed to do about it, to maybe, hopefully, help someone else find the courage to speak up sooner than I did. That's all I can do now. Tell the truth, however late it comes. Honor her memory by being honest about both her courage and my cowardice, and hope that somewhere, somehow, it makes a difference. If you're still here, if you've listened to my entire story, I want to say thank you. Thank you for hearing about Carrie, about what happened to her, about my failures, and my eventual attempt to make things right. Your willingness to hear difficult truths, to spend time with stories that don't have clean, happy endings. That matters more than you know. Before I finish, I have one more favor to ask. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the importance of truth and justice, please hit that like button. I know it seems like a small thing, but it helps stories like mine reach more people. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do, and turn on notifications. There are so many stories like mine out there, stories that need to be told, voices that need to be heard. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what you thought about Carrie's story. Tell me if you've ever faced a situation where you had to choose between safety and truth. And tell me where you're watching from. I'm always amazed by how far these stories can travel, how they can touch people in places I've never been. Most importantly, if you're carrying a secret because you're afraid, if you know something about an injustice but you're too scared to speak up, please consider reaching out to someone. It doesn't have to be the police or the authorities if you don't trust them. But find someone, a lawyer, an advocate, a journalist, a trusted friend. Don't carry that burden alone for 43 years like I did. Looking back on my life, I can see it divided into clear chapters. There was before Carrie died, when I was young and naive, and believed the world was fundamentally fair and safe. There was after Carrie died, but before I spoke up. Those 30 years of fear and guilt and living with a secret that ate away at me. And then there's now, after I finally told the truth, where I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by my silence. I'm 67 years old. I've made terrible mistakes and lived with enormous regret. I failed the person who trusted me most in the world. But I eventually found the courage to speak, however late that courage came. And I've learned that it's never too late to do the right thing, even if you wish you'd done it sooner. To anyone who's ever felt powerless in the face of injustice, who's ever stayed quiet when they should have spoken up, who's ever let fear override their values, I understand. I've been there. But I'm telling you now, speak up anyway. Tell your truth, seek justice, even if it takes decades. Because living with silence is its own kind of prison, and freeing yourself from that prison no matter how long it takes, is worth it. Carrie was 19 years old when she died trying to expose the truth. She was brave in ways I never was at that age, in ways I wouldn't be until I was in my 50s. But she showed me what courage looks like. She showed me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight is dangerous and lonely and the odds are stacked against you. I miss her every single day. I miss who she was and who she would have become. I miss the niece she would have been to my daughters, the great aunt she would have been to my granddaughters. I miss all the conversations we would have had, all the years we would have shared, all the ways she would have made the world better with her fierce commitment to truth and justice. But I'm grateful too. Grateful that I finally told her story. Grateful that Kevin Morrison faced consequences before I died. Grateful for the people who helped me along the way. Sarah Martinez and her investigative team, the witnesses who came forward despite their fear, the Attorney General's office that took my case seriously after so many years. And I'm grateful to you for listening, for caring, for taking the time to hear about a 19-year-old girl who died in 1982 trying to do the right thing. You've given me and given Carrie something precious. You've helped make sure she's remembered not just as a statistic or a tragic accident, but as a real person with dreams and courage and a commitment to truth that cost her everything. It's never too late to seek justice. It's never too late to tell the truth. It's never too late to stand up for what's right, even if you're scared, even if you've already waited too long, even if you think it won't make a difference. Because it does make a difference. Every single truth told, every secret exposed, every voice that refuses to stay silent, it all matters. It all adds up. It all makes the world a little bit more just, a little bit more honest, a little bit closer to what it should be. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to Carrie's story, and to mine. And thank you for helping make sure that what happened 43 years ago isn't forgotten. Take care of yourselves. And please, if you know something that needs to be said, find a way to say it. Don't wait as long as I did. This is Eleanor Hartwell, and this has been my story.